How's that for a slice of fried gold?
You think this is a fucking costume? This is a way of life.
I'll be back.
There's a fresh wound. I'm not gonna hurt you. I'm just gonna bash your brains.
Take your sticking paws off me, you damn dirty ape!
I'm sorry, Dave. I'm afraid I can't do that.
It's alive! It's alive! It's alive!
I guess everyone's entitled to one good scare, huh?
Well, hello, and welcome to Cinema Shock, a podcast exploring the stories behind your favorite cult and genre films. I'm your co-host, Gary Horn.
Hey, I'm co-host Justin Bishop, and we're joined today by writer-comedian Mr. Todd A. Davis.
Welcome, everybody.
Welcome back, Todd. It's been so long.
I know. Thanks for having me back, guys.
We actually did skip a week in our recording schedule this week, but hopefully you didn't realize that because we got this episode out on time.
Yeah,
that's my fault.
I'm speaking that into power. That's what you're supposed to do, right?
Yeah.
Speak it into power.
I think we can do it.
we
Visualize
wrapped up-
it, speak it
Yeah.
into being.
That's right. That's like that book, The Secret. I think that's what that's about, right? Getting podcasts out on time.
That's
I
exactly
think so.
it. That's why it was so popular.
Yeah.
So last week we wrapped up the first part of our Tobe Hooper series. We're going to revisit Tobe Hooper in a few weeks, but as we mentioned last week, we're going to take a little bit of a detour to discuss a man by the name of Dan O'Bannon. And the reason that we're doing that will become clear down the line because him and Tobe Hooper, they do cross paths. The thing about Dan O'Bannon, though, is that he crossed paths with a lot of people. So we could really kind of integrate his story into a lot of different filmmakers' stories. But we think that with Tobe Hooper, it makes kind of the most sense. And as we get into his story over the next few weeks, you'll kind of see why we think that.
Well, we've seen that. We've seen a lot of crossovers already with like George Romero and Tom.
Yeah. That's the great thing about telling
Yeah.
the story of these, these filmmakers is that you do see a lot of interaction and crossover. You kind of, the further we go into it, you start to see kind of the branches of the family tree, of genre filmmaking. A lot of times it's completely unplanned. Like we just start researching and realize, oh, this person already worked with George Romero, or, it's really kind of cool. But this time with Dan O'Bannon, we did it kind of deliberately because I've always been a big fan of his story. And I've always thought that like it would be a fun one to tell because of his connections. Now, if you don't know the name Dan O'Bannon, I wouldn't necessarily blame you. He's not like a household name. He's not as well known as someone like George Romero or Tobe Hooper or Tom Savini or any of the other people that we've talked about. If you do know who he is, or that name does ring a bell, you probably know him as the writer of Ridley Scott's Alien or as the director of Return of the Living Dead. And those are probably his biggest contributions to the world of genre cinema, but he's been involved with more legendary franchises and filmmakers than you probably realize. This is a guy who he has worked in genres of science fiction, horror, action, animation. He's worked with the likes of John Carpenter, Ridley Scott, George Lucas, Paul Verhoeven. There's a very good chance that even though you may not know it, that O'Bannon is at least partially responsible for one of your favorite movies. But the guy, he never really gets the credit. That's the thing with Dan O'Bannon. He's, like I said, he's not a household name because he's never really been put on the pedestal that some of these other quote unquote masters of horror have. And maybe it's because he didn't stick to one genre. Maybe he's not like a horror movie guy necessarily, not like a horror movie filmmaker, like someone like John Carpenter or Tobe Hooper might have been pigeonholed as. And just like we did, in our series on Tobe Hooper, we called that one The Tragedy of Tobe Hooper. We could very easily call this The Tragedy of Dan O'Bannon because, like Hooper, he was never really given the respect in Hollywood that he might have deserved, despite the fact that he helped to create films and usher in careers that have made literally billions of dollars.
Well, he seems like the guy behind the guy. He seems like one of those type of
Yeah, I mean, he does. He is the guy behind the guy, but he also deserves to be seen as a little bit more than that, I think. So why did his career, never really take off the way that maybe it should have? That's something we're going to be discussing over the next few weeks. But first, we have to go back to the beginning with the film that he helped to create while he was still a student at the University of Southern California, which is 1974's Dark Star.
It is the future. Mankind has conquered the stars. He moves out to the endless interstellar reaches of the universe. An advanced exploration corps, a new breed of pioneer, must seek out unstable planets and destroy them. You are on the mission of the 21st century planet smashers. Dark Star. 20 years in space, 1 million light years from Earth. Their job is to clear a path for the colonization of space.
Back home in Malibu. I used to surf a lot, Talby. I used to be a great surfer.
Travel in an infinite universe with mind-melting excitement from beyond the stars.
Commander Powell. Commander Powell, this is Doolittle. Can you hear me?
Man, what happened, man?
Hey.
Confirm. Power drive sequence activated. Roger, retracted. Lock all defensive systems. Dark Star. They're not lost in space. They're loose.
So Dan O'Bannon was born in St. Louis, Missouri in 1946. It didn't take long for him to become a lifelong fan of genre films. A viewing of Howard Hawks' The Thing at age 5 was all that it took. It terrified him as a 5-year-old. And he was hooked. He was a genre fan. He was a sci-fi fan. He was a horror fan for the rest of his life after that viewing, much like John Carpenter.
Is that version of The Thing, as shocking as John Carpenter's? I mean, for the time?
Maybe for the time.
Yeah.
As a modern viewer,
it's a lot more goofy. Yeah.
It's a lot more goofy.
Right.
I think it's still a very good movie. I think it's really The Thing from Another World is the full name of it. I think it's a very good movie, but it's less. I mean, John Carpenter's is apocalyptic, and it is not. The alien's not really. It's not a shapeshifter in that one.
Oh, okay.
It's more of a giant vegetable.
Oh, okay.
I mean, literally, it's a humanoid, but it's vegetable based. We'll probably get into a good long discussion on the Howard Hawks thing down the line when we discuss John Carpenter's. I think that would make a pretty good discussion.
Nice.
But throughout his childhood, Dan O'Bannon, reading sci-fi stories and watching fantasy films became a regular pastime for him. But he didn't immediately know that he wanted to be a filmmaker. He played around with, an 8mm camera in high school, making these little short films and stuff, but it never seemed to really occur to him that this was like an actual career that he could explore. But when he went to college, this kind of continued. He didn't really know what he wanted to do, but this idea of filmmaking was always kind of in the back of his mind. He bounced around to 4 different colleges during that time. He changed his major constantly. First, he went to art school in Washington, at Washington University, which is there in St. Louis, where he grew up. And while going to Washington University, he was doing stand-up comedy routines. He did makeup for theater productions there on campus. He provided illustrations for the student newspaper. He did everything. Like, even early on in his career, O'Bannon was kind of a jack of all trades.
Nice.
And while attending Washington University, his roommate there was a guy by the name of Michael Schamberg, who would go on to be a very powerful movie producer. He produced movies like A Fish Called Wanda, Reality Bites, Pulp Fiction, Aaron Brockovich. He's actually part of Jersey Films with Danny DeVito, who's produced quite a lot of Tarantino's work.
Oh, nice.
So he would later transfer to Florissant Valley Junior College in Ferguson, Missouri. And it was there that he made kind of his first quote unquote real short film, as opposed to the stuff he was just making like as a kid. He directed a short science fiction satire called The Attack of the 50-Foot Chicken. I tried to find it online. I could only find clips of it.
I was about to say I could only ever find clips. I really wanted to find it. Now, I will say, so for some gumption for the guy, he apparently petitioned the school to buy him the camera that he used to shoot this thing. So,
oh yeah,
not the chicken, but the actual film itself. But and I say that because the only clip I could really find of it was a guy that it was like 5 minutes of a army dude lining up a shot to shoot a giant chicken. I mean, it wasn't, the chicken was not near anything to like give it size. You just had to guess that it was a giant
you had
chicken,
to pretend that it was 50 feet tall.
Right.
Suspend your disbelief.
Right.
Yeah. So according to Dan O'Bannon, he was reading an issue of Playboy magazine And he says that he's like, I'd already, worked my way through I'd already enjoyed the centerfolds in Playboy and several times. So I was looking for things to read. So he was actually reading Playboy for the articles.
A likely story.
It was, well, he admits that he wasn't initially reading it for the articles, but he's like, I got all the enjoyment I could out of the centerfolds and stuff. So then I just started reading it. And he found an article that discussed the best film schools in the country, which led him to apply at the University of Southern California. And it's funny because despite his involvement in the arts, working in theater and illustration and all this stuff, he was actually pursuing a psychology degree at the time that he applied to USC's film school, because he like had a revelation. He's like suddenly thought, he's like, wait a minute, I don't want to be a psychologist. So after doing some soul searching, he decided he would go on to try to be a filmmaker, this thing that he'd always enjoyed but never really saw as a career. He's like, what the hell, let's go for it. So he got accepted to USC, and he described that experience as lonely and frustrating. Ooh. But it was there at USC that he met his future collaborator, a man by the name of John Carpenter.
Now, listen, I've got to say this up front because y'all know me and y'all know I want to talk about John Carpenter, but I'm going to try to restrain myself a little bit here because I love him so much, and JC is bae. That said, I'll just say this. He's not coming from a dissimilar background. This is a story more about Dan O'Bannon, but small town in Kentucky, that sort of thing. His buddy Tommy Lee Wallace, who we'll talk about, I'm sure, because he works on this film, is who got him over to USC. They'd known each other since they were kids. Wallace and him became friends, and they're like really good friends in their teens. To hear Tommy Lee Wallace talk about him, John Carpenter was basically a prodigy. He was constantly writing music, writing little novels, making films. It was a mission for him to just create artistically. And to hear Wallace describe it, by the time he was looking at college, he already just knew so much about making movies. He just didn't know how to finish it. Like how to, as the great philosopher Larry the Cable Guy would say, he didn't know how to get her done. So like he knew how to work everything. He just didn't know what to do from there. And Wallace started telling him about like maybe you should go to school for it. I just saw some stories with Tommy Lee Wallace saying that he basically just handed him the college blue book, which is like lists all of the institutes of higher learning. And Carpenter immediately found UCLA and USC and decided he had to get to one of those. And he finally landed on USC because maybe it just, I don't know, had the better rep for what he was trying to achieve. So
and I know Gary is probably dying to like talk a lot about John Carpenter's background, but like he said, this is a series on Dan O'Bannon. And while we will be discussing John Carpenter pretty extensively on this episode, us and we're going to do a John Carpenter series down the line. So there will be plenty of time to talk about John Carpenter and his childhood and his upbringing and his career. So if you're wondering why we don't get further into that during this, I mean, that's why basically.
Yeah.
All in good time.
I was trying to set myself
up, dear listeners.
I was trying to let you all know too that I was not going to ramble about John Carpenter at some point during this episode about how great I is and his life story. I was just getting him to the same place as Dan O'Bannon.
Hey, yeah. So it's important to keep in mind that in the late 1960s, film school wasn't really a thing. We hear about it now and people going to film school, and that wasn't really a thing back then. Prior to this, most of the filmmaking that USC's quote unquote film school was teaching was to train cameramen for the military. It wasn't like filmmaking techniques and things like that. And all that changed when a new group of filmmakers, guys like George Lucas, Steven Spielberg, Francis Ford Coppola, Brian De Palma, collectively known as the movie brats, because they were kind of the first generation to come out of true film school. They began to go to school to learn technique to make dramatic films, not just, shooting war footage.
It's funny to me because somehow because of the BS we've all had to endure through the Star Wars prequels, that when I was reading stuff about this, I mean, the two names you'd see over and over again were for legends for film students were George Lucas and Francis Ford Coppola. And George Lucas was, I think, because he was out of USC, he was their legend guy, and UCLA, I think, was Coppola. So that was like their legend guy. So when you were looking to be a film student, you were like, do you want to go to the Lucas school or the Coppola school?
Well, the thing with Lucas and we will probably touch on this more in depth down the line when we discuss him. We discussed it a little bit on our old show when we did the original Star Wars trilogy, but he wanted to be like an experimental filmmaker. He considered himself an art filmmaker. And if you see his early stuff, one of which we're about to discuss, you can kind of see that. I think Lucas kind of got swallowed by the monster that Star Wars became and ended up like a billionaire, but not necessarily creatively doing what he wanted to do.
Well, because I always thought his baby was THX, like the company. Like I always saw him as more of like his thing that he was really was the tech side.
He became very interested in the tech side. Yes. I don't know that was originally his intention, but he was always kind of fascinated by that. Anyway, that's something we'll have to discuss on a George Lucas series down the line.
Yeah.
But speaking of George Lucas, when John Carpenter first arrived at USC, he saw a short film called Electronic Labyrinth THX 11384EB, which is directed by George Lucas. It's something that he just rolls off the tongue. Yeah. It was something that George Lucas had made while he was a student there, and Lucas was soon developing his short into a feature-length movie with the thankfully shortened title of simply THX 1138. But Carpenter saw that and he's like, this is how we do it. This is how I can get a movie made.
Here's the thing with him. He's already thinking about how this could be transitioned into something bigger for him. But also
not just a student film.
Yeah. And also around this time, the school's learning a little bit about the business side of things. And I've got some stuff on that for in just a little bit, but I harp on this every episode. And Todd, you kind of mentioned it, just how much I love this crossover that we see all of the time. So this may be oversimplifying just a bit, but kids, today you have already learned how, if it had not been for George Lucas, Michael Myers and zombies that crave brains may never have existed.
It's very true. Yeah. Very true. So another film that caught Carpenter's attention while he was there as a student was one called Bloodbath, another little short film made by a fellow student. This film, which features a sort of, I haven't seen it. I've not seen Bloodbath. I'll admit that. I believe it's on YouTube. I read a lot about it. So the description that I read describes it as sort of a melancholy. It's got this main character who's this sort of melancholy misanthrope going about his daily life. And then there's this like stream of consciousness narration over it. Like it sounds very bizarre, but
sounds very much like an angsty student made that.
Yeah. But and the narration in the film, though not the performance, was done by the film's director, which was Dan O'Bannon. Oh. So they showed this. The audience enjoyed the film at first. Like it felt like a setup to a dark joke. That's how people who saw it described it. They liked it up to a certain point because the whole thing's playing like it's set up, it's a short film and there's going to be this big exclamation point, this big punchline at the end. But instead of a punchline, the main character slits his wrists in a bathtub. So people like this happens and the people in the audience are just silent or like uncomfortable, or some of them got mad. Some of them got angry about it. One woman yelled, "That's not fair." during the screening.
No, if that's not some edgelord goth shit.
But John Carpenter loved it. So after the screening, he actually approached O'Bannon to let him know that, hey, I loved your short film. And O'Bannon was flattered. And they got talking, and he explained to Carpenter that the idea for this movie began with the idea that blood splattered on white tile could be a beautiful thing, a beautiful image. So you got to remember, O'Bannon started his college career as an art student. And as a former art student, for O'Bannon, horror first started with an image, like a single image in his mind, and then all the possibilities of that image.
But side note for everyone listening, not a good way to introduce yourself to most people. Luckily, John Carpenter buys right in. But this, by the way, is fucking Dan O'Bannon. He's a character. They all are. But this guy's a little out there, and it's not even just that he's trying to impress you with his artsy or downer view on the world. He's also, from everything I can read about him, is testing you to see if he even wants to associate with you. Jack Harris, who's a producer we'll talk about later, we haven't got to him yet, but he even tells a story about the first time he met Dan O'Bannon, that Dan O'Bannon hands him a Polaroid, and he looks at it and he can't quite make out the image. And he says, "What is this?" And Dan O'Bannon's like, "It's an extraterrestrial." And he's like, "Okay." And he's like, "Where'd you get this?" He's like, "I took it in the woods by my house." And He's like, okay, I don't know that I believe that. And Dan O'Bannon proceeds to explain to him that, well, no, not really. But my dad used to do this all the time and he would sell them and he taught me how to make them. And then Jack Harris tells him that doesn't seem like a very practical way to do business. And then from that point on, Dan O'Bannon always hated Jack Harris. And,
well, he hated Jack Harris for other reasons. That we'll get into
it's not
later
just
on.
that, but to hear Jack Harris tell that story,
Jack Harris.
He says he hated him from there. And you could, anybody you find that talks about Dan O'Bannon, including his own wife, says that he either loved you or he hated you, and there was no in between.
And he had a temper, and he was cantankerous and difficult, and that doesn't discount how good he was at his job. He wasn't abusive to anyone, except not even verbally abusive. I think he was just kind of if he didn't like you, you just knew it. It wasn't like he would cuss you out. He just didn't adhere himself to you. You know,
he just wouldn't engage with you, really. Yeah. Like he just wouldn't have anything to do with you. And if he liked you, he was just all over you to hang out with you.
So once O'Bannon and Carpenter started talking, the two realized that they had a lot in common with each other. A mutual love for Howard Hawks, A Thing from Another World, for example, but also, as Gary kind of mentioned earlier, very similar backgrounds. So John Carpenter proposed that they make a movie together. And when they start planning this, John Carpenter, he's kind of modeling his low budget sci-fi movie on that George Lucas film he'd seen, THX 1138, because it had proven that you didn't need elaborate special effects or studio money to make science fiction. And the two, John Carpenter and O'Bannon, despite their kind of similar upbringings, they made a pretty odd couple personality-wise, because O'Bannon was very wound up and intense and sometimes, like I said, hard to handle. So Terrence Winkless, who was a fellow student that O'Bannon had worked on another short film and who works on this, said that when he first met O'Bannon, he walked into O'Bannon's room and he found a gun sitting on a stack of porn. That was his introduction to him. This is a guy, that's just not something you see in 1960s, Southern California.
What, he'll be a red-blooded American?
Listen, you haven't lived till you're spanking it to Playboy with a loaded weapon in your mouth.
Oh,
I mean, that's the only way to spank it to Playboy is with a loaded weapon.
It's the only way I can get off anymore.
But O'Bannon, O'Bannon did like his guns. That's actually a fun fact about O'Bannon that I didn't realize before researching this. He was actually a kind of a gun nut, and he liked porn. He was into porn. Because this is already the second reference we've had on this episode. So another time, though, with Winkless, another story he tells is one time they went out to eat at a diner, and O'Bannon ordered coffee, a tea, and a Coca-Cola. And when the waitress thought he was joking, because there's nobody's going to consume that much caffeine. He's got to be joking. So she didn't bring it all to him, and he flew into a rage. And this is Winkless is telling the story. He's O'Bannon could kind of fly off the handle. He had a temper. But he's just a very odd guy and very tightly wound. Whereas Carpenter was kind of aloof and easygoing and quiet and gentle and very just kind of chill. I mean, Carpenter nowadays has sort of a reputation of being this cranky old man. But if you read any stories about him as a young filmmaker, he was very much this easygoing hippie, long-haired hippie type, and very kind of just calm and quiet in his speech, but polar opposite basically of Dan O'Bannon. But the dynamic worked. I mean, although their personalities were very different, they had a lot, like I said, they had a lot in common. Both of them felt like outsiders in their small conservative towns that they'd grown up with, O'Bannon in Missouri and Carpenter in Kentucky. And they had both at a young age found solace in monster movies.
The thing that sounds fun about USC at this time is that they're all a bunch of hippies. They didn't have any choice but to interact with each other. Like Justin mentioned before, this was just getting fleshed out as a film school. So it wasn't
so much like them teaching you film as them throwing you together with a bunch of other people who wanted to learn how to make movies, and then giving you the equipment to do so.
Yeah, exactly. They literally took these people and put them in a stable, like a literal stable. They said that there was horseback riding right across the way. And so you're constantly working with other people on their projects. You're sitting around discussing film theory, etc. and you build like a real camaraderie with like everybody that you're working with. It sounds like a really cool environment, but you know, it was also thrown together. Like we said, I mean, the sound stage had mattresses on the wall, and they said you'd like dream about like the clicking of the film canisters or whatever. Like they're learning from like looking at little moviolas, and all these things are like constantly running in the background. But it was like their own little world. But also, like you'd be there, and actual like real life film experts would stop by. They said, you know, one day just Hitchcock might show up, and
Roman Polanski was a big one that stopped by and had a lot of influence on these guys.
Jeez. Yeah, and they sent in everybody.
This is right when, I mean, this was late '60s. This was when Polanski had just made Rosemary's Baby.
Yeah. The thing I find interesting is, you know, him being a psych major. I wonder if we're going to get into if that influenced his writing, because it seems like from Dark Star, you know, there's some, it touches on some heavy themes. I mean, getting a little bit ahead, but you know, and him fitting in at film school, and they all seem to find these horror movies, which, you know, more often than not focus on quote unquote the other. And so they all probably felt that way. So they all had that immediate bond.
I think everybody had like those different interests, and like I think O'Bannon even was like interested in like Lovecraft and stuff early on, and and he'll work on that stuff later.
Carpenter too,
and Carpenter obviously. So the cool part I was thinking about with the film school thing is that one thing you can count on with these guys though is because they're all helping each other with each other's projects. You learn every single aspect of filmmaking. By the time you leave there, you know your shit because you've done that job at some point. But back to the Carpenter and O'Bannon relationship, and it was interesting to be sure. Like Justin mentioned, Carpenter being more reserved. He was opinionated, but he was really laid back. And O'Bannon was, I was like running through my notes, and I was like, O'Bannon was well known for being loud. And you know what? Here's the thing. I'm just going to write down every word I've heard so far to describe him in interviews I've watched. So here they are. Unusual, angry a lot, hard to miss, extremely intense as a person, had a cosmic outlook on life, grim, dismissive, big voice, big personality. If he liked you, he would really engage. Very funny, loose cannon. John was gentle, Dan on edge. that was like the description of
Grim dismissal.
Yeah, grim dismissive was
grim dismissive. I think that's going to be my stage name in my new goth band, my goth industrial. Grim dismissive,
right? And I think what attracted Carpenter too was from some stuff I was reading that Dark Star was going to be his grad project, and he initially approached Dan about acting in it. Like he loved the personality, and that was his first idea. It, of course, naturally evolved. Because O'Bannon is just like this highly creative person that it started offering ideas, and they became more and more collaborative. Always at night, by the way, always at night. O'Bannon only works at nighttime because you can't tell how much time is passing. Daylight, like you could tell, but at night you have no idea what time it is.
Interesting.
I don't know that was his thing.
So Dark Star did begin its life as a student film. It's supposed to be a 45-minute student film to be shot on 16 millimeter with a budget of about $1,000 that was going to be supplied by the school. And it was going to be, like Gary said, it was supposed to be their like senior project. And the original concept was Carpenter's. He described it as truck drivers in space, which is something we'll hear probably more next week on the movie we're talking about. And then O'Bannon, quote, fleshed out many of the original ideas, and he contributed a lot of the script's like funnier moments, like the comedy in it. A lot of that is O'Bannon's. And on the final film, the two of them share a screenwriting credit.
They pitched it kind of like an anti-2001.
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
Yeah. Both guys
even the poster plays on that. It says like a spaced out Odyssey or something.
Yeah, right.
Nice.
Both guys were fans of Kubrick, but to hear O'Bannon talk about it, it was just funny to him that he had a quote that said, the movie takes this enormous concept of spaceflight, then the evolution and manipulation of man, then puts you on this gigantic spacecraft headed to Jupiter, and it's going to take years to get there. And then it bores you silly with tedium, day to day, jogging, watching TV, eating meals. I love that. But they were affected by that. Like JC talked about, O'Bannon talks a lot about strange love when he talks about this movie. And Carpenter talks a lot about Waiting for Godot. They just loved that like absurdist humor and just that sort of thing. That's what they were going for here. And I'm sure we'll talk about it, but they were definitely going for a comedy feel. And I don't think that everybody got that.
No, they definitely did not. So they began developing the film in about 1970, filming on a soundstage at USC. But the film's journey would be a pretty strange one. And 4 years later, now on a soundstage in Hollywood, the film would be completed with a final budget of about $60,000, mostly raised from friends and family. It was kind of a stop and start process. They would make like 10 minutes worth of footage, show that to some potential investors, make another 10 minutes, repeat the process over and over and over until they actually were able to finish the movie. And this was very much like a student production, at least at first. They would shoot in closets instead of sound stages, using styrofoam for spacesuits and ice trays for the control panels. I think there's a muffin tin on the front of the space suit at one point.
There definitely is.
Yeah,
and
I spotted that.
That was O'Bannon, and his wife says that when
he had never seen a muffin tin before.
Yeah, when he talks about it later, that he's just like, I wouldn't do that again, but I had never seen a muffin tin before, and it looked exotic to me.
So it was filmed, like Gary said, almost entirely at night, but that wasn't necessarily because of O'Bannon only wanting to work at night. It was because most of the cast and crew had day jobs. Also, they were still students. And while Carpenter receives, and I think deserves, the credit as the film's director, O'Bannon should really share credit as one of the true creators of this film. In front of and behind the camera, he was integral to the production. He worked not only as the film's writer, but its editor, production designer, and special effects supervisor. Like he had more jobs on this than Carpenter did. Wow. Carpenter had three. Carpenter had three. Before we get into it too much more, I do want to give a kind of a few notes on some of the other guys who worked behind the scenes on this film, because remember, everyone working on this was a student at the time. While they didn't have any real experience before this film, a lot of people who were involved in this behind the scenes in various, crew member roles went on to have long, successful careers in filmmaking. So this is kind of, we talked about the family tree of like these genre movies like this. You start looking at some of the people who were going to USC at the time and who happened to work on this, and they've worked on some monumental stuff. So Ron Cobb was a designer. He was responsible for the design of the Dark Star spaceship itself. Cobb was a fellow student there at USC, and he would go on to be a production designer or work in the art department on films like Conan the Barbarian, James Cameron's Aliens, Raiders of the Lost Ark, The Abyss, Avatar. Like he does a lot of James Cameron movies. While O'Bannon loved kind of making sketches of spaceship designs and aliens, it was Cobb who brought a sense of reality to the film's design. He was an illustrator for the Los Angeles Free Press, a political cartoonist, and an avid fan of Isaac Asimov. And as a fan of Isaac Asimov, he believed that science fiction needed to be based on real science in order to remain relevant. So he really tried to create a lot of the design of the spaceship in this as one that would be, functional for the most part.
Very, very Star Trek approach to sci-fi.
For sure.
And you can find like discussions with him on like some of the designs on like what he did. Like, I mean, they took him, like, I think O'Bannon took him to, they had a house of pancakes near the school they talked about, and he immediately
the International House of Shit is what they called it.
Yeah, exactly. And he starts sketching out stuff, and just all the practical things and missed opportunities he thought he had seen in like sci-fi movies that they should or could have done. And so like in this one, I remember some of the stuff he was saying was just like the way space flight's portrayed, the slim shape of the ship, like to be more efficient, the crew quarters in the back, to be away from like potential shock waves and that kind of stuff, like as it's flying. And anyway, just he put a lot
not
of
necessarily stuff the audience is going to think about, but a different approach than what had been done with sci-fi so far. And you also have to remember, this is before Star Wars and before Alien. So prior to this, space travel in films and television on stuff like Star Trek or 2001 tended to be a very sanitized, very clean looking, and paid very little effort to show what real space travel might look like. But Cobb and O'Bannon were determined to make the inside of their spacecraft seem practical. It was function over form, essentially. It was what would actually work versus what looked good on a screen.
It feels very lived in.
It does. And that whole lived in approach. I mean, Star Wars and Alien get all the credit for that because they popularized it more than this, but this movie did it this is 3 years before Star Wars. So after designing the Dark Star, the ship, Cobb would hand the design off to a guy named Craig Jean, who was a special effects artist who specialized in building miniatures. And he would actually go on to work on everything from Close Encounters of the Third Kind to multiple Star Trek movies and TV shows. Like, he was the main miniatures guy on a lot of Star Trek. Then Tommy Lee Wallace, who Gary mentioned earlier, he was a childhood friend of Carpenter's. He was the film's art director. Wallace, of course, would go on to work with Carpenter more later on in his career, helping to design the Michael Myers mask in Halloween. I mean, he's responsible for Michael Myers' look, and he was also the director of Halloween 3 and also the It miniseries, I believe, right? Didn't he do the It miniseries?
The It miniseries. Yeah. He did like Amityville 2. He's done a lot of stuff. He was brought into
Night 2, I think.
Yeah, I think that's right. He was there to help Dan. He got brought into. He talks a lot about they couldn't match 2001's antiseptic look, I think is how he put it, and so they were trying to go the exact opposite, barely working, falling apart. They said, they just described like it's like a effed up space, like just this cramped quarters, and then outside it's all this wires and 2x4s and stuff, and then like you mentioned, like ashtrays for buttons, push pins in different places, anything that had texture and that light could shine through it, they were using. They were talking about how cramped it was, like that opening scene where it shows the scene where they're like all cramped in that control area, and the camera like moves through them. They were talking about it's just like a little wind up camera on a plank, and they just have it like pulling it back, and everybody's like up with their arms in the air, sucking in as much as they can so it can move through them. And then as soon as it passes them, they have to act like they're working. Really
it's
quick.
A great shot, honestly. That was the shot that, like, because it's so early on in the film, I was like, shit, man, Carpenter like knew what he was doing from a visual standpoint, like immediately. Because that is like not a shot that you see in like a little student film shot on 16 millimeter.
It's crazy, man. They talked about like the dome on top of the ship, where the guy's sitting up there, and
R2D2.
Yeah, but that dome is like just this. It was like a little mini dome sprayed with some kind of dulling agent, and they said that it's actually like 2 feet in front of the camera, and then there's like a long hallway where the chair is, and the guy's laying on the floor. And so like he like slowly gets up off the floor, but it looks so like just the way it's all set up, like he's inside the dome.
You would never know that by looking at it.
Yeah, I know. It's just insane to me. I don't just people thinking way outside the box.
I mean, when you're that's what I love when we talk about these like lower budget genre movies, especially genre movies, because it's easier to do a lower budget like drama, like character based, where it's mostly dialogue, whatnot. Obviously, you've still got all the expense of the actual film and sets and stuff, but I love talking about these like low budget genre movies where people just have to get creative, like in order to really, they're portraying space travel.
Right.
And they had $1,000. I mean, then they had $6,000 and eventually they had $60,000. We'll get into how that happened, but still that's peanuts. That's no money. And they're able to recreate space travel. Yeah. I mean, the budget shows at times, but there are some things that they're doing like what Gary just described. That's like, that is very clever, just really clever to be able to figure that out.
Yeah, man. I mean, you're talking about, these space suits are like thrown together. I think they were like a fire jacket and ski gloves or something. They're just like
toy
duct taped
astronaut helmet.
Yeah, a toy astronaut helmet. And I even remember like hearing I forget the actor's name right off the top of my head, but in the helmet,
Brian Norell?
Breathe. Yeah, I think it's Brian Norell. He's talking about he can't breathe inside side of it. And O'Bannon's actually the one who helps him out finally. They run a tube up like through the suit and into the helmet. So he's like having to breathe through the tube that's poking out the back of the suit or whatever.
Until they say action.
Until they say action, then he could spit out the tube.
Well, and not only was he couldn't breathe, but it was fogging up the inside of the thing.
Right.
With his breath, So the film cinematographer was a guy named Douglas Knapp. He would work with Carpenter on his next film, Assault on Precinct 13. And he also served as the cinematographer on most episodes of Star Trek Voyager and Enterprise.
Ooh.
I just like throwing in Star Trek references for Todd.
Yay!
Every time I see them now, I make sure to note them down.
It's a lot. There's a lot. Like the last several episodes, there's been some sort of Star Trek connection. It's
no
kind of
wrestlers
crazy
in this one.
honestly.
I don't know what the hell's going on.
And then Nick Castle, another friend of Carpenter's, was a camera assistant on the film. and also played the uncredited role of the alien in the film. We'll get to the alien in a minute, guys. And Castle, of course, would go on to play a pretty important role in another Carpenter film, where you couldn't see his face. Nick Castle was the original Michael Myers, aka The Shape, in John Carpenter's Halloween.
I thought I read.
He'd also go on to be a director himself. His most well-known film was probably The Last Starfighter,
which is one of my favorite movies ever. But
great movie.
Props to Castle, though. Yeah, he was one of those guys that was around there. They just described as having timing. Like, he just always seemed to have timing down for everything. He just seems
like a good dude, honestly. Like, I would like to meet Nick Castle one day.
Yeah, they said like comedic timing and everything. But yeah, I mean, obviously proven here and with Michael Myers and stuff, he just knows how to bring life to something.
So Gary talked about a couple of the like innovative techniques that they used on this film, like the dome thing. And, another one of the ones that they did that I thought was really cool was creating some special effects, because obviously there's no CGI, and they have a minuscule budget for special effects. So one of the things that they did that I thought was really interesting was how Dan O'Bannon depicted the Dark Star going into hyperspace. And by that, I mean, like when you see them go and the stars turn into streaks, basically, So to do this, he created an animated effect where he would track the camera while leaving the shutter open. So they had these stars, on like a black screen. They'd move the camera through it, leave the shutter open, and it turned those, by having a longer shutter time, the stars turned into streaks. Pretty lo-fi way to figure that out, but clever. And that doesn't seem like a big deal now because we see this effect everywhere now, but this was 3 years before Star Wars would utilize and popularize the same effect. But Dark Star is actually thought to be the first depiction of a spaceship jumping into hyperspace in a film. So this is actually the first time that particular effect, which we see in Star Wars, we see in Star Trek, like all kinds of shows where something goes into hyperdrive or warp drive or whatever, you see the stars turn into streaks. It started here on Dark Star.
Nice. Yeah, they say obviously we've mentioned him a few times, but that George Lucas had to have seen this movie coming out of USC, another student film that was really popular.
I made a joke about R2-D2 earlier, but I legit think that dome on top of the ship was in George Lucas's mind when he visualized R2 sitting on the back. That's a good point. I mean,
it could be. Yeah. But definitely the hyperdrive effect is that this was the first time it had ever been used. And oddly enough, I mean, O'Bannon even talks about THX was the first time he had really ever seen in a ship like this, like video monitors doing the things that they were doing. And he was so impressed and wanted to do that in this movie. So they did it. And then later George Lucas. So we know George Lucas has seen it because actually I remember now Dan O'Bannon saying that George Lucas tapped him for Star Wars with some of the effects because of
like the animation on the computer screens,
right? Because he saw what O'Bannon had done with the computer screens in this movie, so he was like, so we did a nice little two-step.
This is like the Godfather of sci-fi, the Godfather of like modern sci-fi films.
Modern sci-fi, yeah, absolutely. And I mean, and they were playing on 2001, so you could say 2001 is the original innovator, but they were also sort of subverting what 2001 did in a way. So O'Bannon wasn't the only one multitasking on the film. I said he had, he's a production designer, art director, all this stuff. But Carpenter, of course, he was the director and the writer. But he also, as he would later become known to do, composed the film's score using a modular synthesizer. And I love the score to this movie.
Man, you can totally hear it. Like everything from here on, like is in this movie.
It's a great Carpenter score that doesn't get discussed as much as some of his other synthesizer scores, but man, there's something about it that adds production value to the film. And they did it using a synthesizer because obviously we can't afford an orchestra, so that's the most cost-effective way to do it. And it is just, I think it just adds a whole layer to this film that really just puts the movie on another level, really.
Yeah. From my understanding, that's something that gets added later with Jack Harris, that like he had pitched to Jack Harris to establish himself. He had done music. He had established himself with music. USC, and had done it on a like I forget something Doe or I can't remember the name of it. He had done something for some music in another film because he was always trying to get that in there, but he had to like pitch it to Harris to let him score the entire movie because he knew exactly what he wanted it to sound like. I don't know, man, just these people. And one of the cool things about O'Bannon and Carpenter that they both liked was bucking authority. So like this soundstage is, I think, where they're using the film, you're supposed to get it for like 2 weeks locked down. That's it. That's all you've got. And they would proceed to use this thing for months and months and months and months. Like they would just sneak in there and do some of this stuff. Brian Norell does some great stuff on a documentary I watched, and they came and got
Let
him.
There Be Light or something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a great doc.
He was talking about, I think he had been pulled into animating title sequences for The Howling, he said, and John Carpenter came to him and said, he had another project he was working on in December, and John's like, it'll be November. We'll do it in November and we'll be done. He's like, all right. And he said, then it was that November, and it was the next year in November, and the next year in November. He's like, it just never stopped. But
kept going.
Yeah. But anyway, he just it's just funny hearing them tell the stories. Like that Cal guy who plays a Boiler. They said nobody knows where that guy came from. Like, he just was like a business major John Carpenter found or something.
Yeah, he doesn't have any other credits at all on IMDb.
Yeah, he just like brought him in and said they never saw him not on set. Like they never saw him off this, outside of the movie. Like he was so just weird. There for the movie. And they said the only story I could find fun about him was the switchblade scene where he's like stabbing it between his fingers. That was not scripted. He just started doing that and legit does stab his finger and plays it off. And they kept rolling, and so he didn't sell it until afterwards.
Well, going back to the music, the song that plays over the opening credits, that Benson, Arizona song, which cracks me up. It's so funny to me. That was co-written by Carpenter. Carpenter did the music, and then Bill Taylor did the lyrics, and a friend of theirs who was a singer who ended up doing the vocals on it. But I don't know why, but it's really funny to me that song plays over. And the lyrics are really funny and somewhat relevant to the film. But there's something about a country song playing over the opening credits of a sci-fi movie that just is really funny to me.
Yeah, it works so well. Like it's just something's fun about that. Just the mix of the country western thing and sci-fi. Yeah. Like it's just
to me it kind of lends it blue collar quality of like again sure. lived in, and these guys are they're doing the job, man, and that's their thing.
Well, somebody, I feel like I read somewhere that they had considered like a classical song or something else. Maybe it was even O'Bannon on this part too, but it had pitched the country song because of the truck drivers and the space aspect of it.
Right.
They'd be listening to country. And side note, Bill Taylor tells the story that Benson is just a place that he was visiting his girlfriend, and he broke down in Benson, Arizona, and on Christmas Day, and two guys helped him out and got his car fixed and got it back on the road. And he's always remembered them as being nice. So they were like, what's the most out of the way, like random ass place we can think of? And he's like, Benson, Arizona.
And now Benson, Arizona actually has a road called Dark Star Road.
Oh, really?
Nice. Because this movie's their claim to fame, I guess.
That's so cool, man. But everybody in here this is going to play into Somebody Needs a Nap later. So I just want to establish that Bill Taylor guy, he's worked on a lot too since then. He's been a visual effects supervisor.
Oh, on huge stuff. I mean, his IMDb is a mile long. Like if you look at his filmography, it's wild.
And that Brian Norell guy, he doesn't do anything
like that, right?
Yeah. And Brian Norell is like an animator. He's worked on like Sesame Street for forever, and like worked with George Lucas on Twice Upon a Time. He's done his own shorts and stuff and won awards. And he teaches cartooning at the Charles Schulz Museum. So
wow.
I was looking that up. But
that's pretty cool.
Yeah, so all these guys are like really talented people that go on to do things, even if they're not
lots
like
of things,
straight up actors or something.
And not everyone, I mean, most of them are not like a name that everyone would recognize, but that's the case on a lot of guys who work behind the scenes on movies. Like people know who Steven Spielberg is, people know who Christopher Nolan is, people know who Quentin Tarantino is, but they don't know all these other, who did the special effects, who did the art direction, who did the music, even a lot of times, just because they're not getting all the glory doesn't mean that they don't deserve some sort of recognition.
Yeah, they're great, man. Those art map paint. I mean, the spaceship flying, that's what blew me away when I was first watching this. Was just like, this is early on. They're doing a pretty good job with these spaceships. I mean, it's cheesy, but it's it's still like, if you had me do it, like you set me down or like film the space scene, I'd be like, I don't fucking know how to do that. But they were like these like models on dollies, like going towards like the matte paintings and stuff like that. Like that's kind of cool. Like I don't know.
Wild.
Another one I thought was interesting, and since I'm just talking about it now, was like Carpenter wanted the bomb carrier, like bomb 20 or whatever it's called. He wanted it to have something for when they were communicating with it, that it looked like it was talking back, you know, not just it was just sitting there. But yeah, it lights
That's
up.
O'Bannon's voice, by the way.
Oh yeah.
As the bomb.
So it flashes lights, but it doesn't really have flashing lights on it. You know, it's just like they built the right like silver plating or whatever, and then they like clicked a light towards it and it reflected the light. And I just thought
they put reflective tape on it.
That's what it was. Yeah.
Yeah. They put reflective tape on it in the places where they wanted the lights. And then, they would like click a light while they were filming to make it quote unquote light up, but it's not, it's really just reflecting the light that they were shining at.
It's just one of those dinky things that I think nobody would think about. And he's just like, well, obviously that thing's lighting up, but it's like, well, how much harder is it to make a thing that lights up? And they couldn't, or they just didn't have time or money. And so they just put the reflective tape in there and they're just like clicking this light at it. And it looks like it's lighting. I don't know, man. It's just movie magic, dog. It gets me.
It's cool. It's cool. So Carpenter and O'Bannon, they worked well together because they were both intense perfectionists, like both of them, which, so they wanted everything to be perfect, which sounds pretty high stress for everyone else on set. But they were proud of the film that they completed by the end of the shoot. They knew it wasn't like 2001, but they were pretty sure that this is a movie that can help kickstart our careers. And like we said, it was originally conceived and created as a school project, but they knew that they had something kind of special. They started trying to sell the film, but no one was buying. And this was like in the days of The Exorcist and the early films of Scorsese and Coppola, space movies seemed old-fashioned at the time. This is before Star Wars kind of brought them back. I mean, you'd had 2001, but that was a decade earlier, almost. Studios just didn't want to touch a space movie. It just didn't seem like something that would sell.
Well, I think this is important for where this whole story is going here, real quick, if I can, is that one thing to know about John Carpenter here that I think is going to influence his motivation so you can get a better understanding of him, is that he was, during this time also at USC, he became a member of a crew, and they were working on the movie The Resurrection of Bronco Billy. And it was a Western movie. It was a short film. And the school backed it, and they spent like $2,000 to $3,000 on it to get it made. They released it on 35 millimeter. John Carpenter was one of the main writers and got some director's experience, but it's like uncredited on this movie. And I think he's credited as a writer, and it's important in this way. So this movie gets sent out and it wins an Oscar for best short.
Best live action short.
Yeah. And so when that happened, the school sent school reps, and they sent like one student, I think he said his name was like John Longnecker or something, to the Oscars to collect the award. And I want to say it was Brian Norell talks about that he saw John. He said they were all just in their dorm rooms watching the Oscars that night, and it won. And John came out to get a Coke. And they met in the cafeteria. He was just like, "Hey, congratulations, John." And John's like, "Hey, thanks, man." And they like shook hands, and he went back to his dorm room. And he said that later that, John Carpenter talks about this. He says that later they like bring back the trophy in a brown paper bag. Like the school walks it through and they're like, "Hey, here's your trophy. Look at this. You won this." And they're like, "Cool." And he's like, "Do I get to like keep it, or like what happens with it?" And they're like, "Well, we'll just put it somewhere. We'll just, or whatever." He's like, "Okay, well, so what's this mean for me?" And they're like, "Well, nothing." It's
well, the way that the studios, or the way that the school saw it, was that they were like the studio who essentially owned the film because they were funding it for the students.
Yeah, that is how they saw it. So earlier when I was saying like the school's learning these things, I think possibly from THX, which goes on to become like a feature length movie. And I don't know if the school made anything off that, but with this one, they totally took everything. And Carpenter even says he was like asking for like, "Well, can we get reimbursed for some of the stuff we spent on it?" and like that we spent. And the school's like, nah, they just like waved him off. And Carpenter said it fucked him up. Like that was it. He was just like, well, I'm not playing this game anymore. Who are you? Like, where did I sign off that you get to take a movie that I made and you get to, like, what kind of art school is this? He was pissed. Like he talks about it a lot. He said,
well, if you go to art school and
no stake in this.
If you go to art school and you paint a painting, the painting doesn't belong to the art school. It still belongs to the artist. Right. So that's the same concept here. The film should still belong to the filmmakers.
I say all that to say that, so you can imagine that John Carpenter's mindset already is not only that he's immediately just like a buck authority guy, but he's also already a buck this school too. And he's kind of like, I already know what's going to happen with Dark Star if it does anything. And so his goal from the beginning is like, you brought it up, Justin, but just that he's seeing it as an out. Like, this is how I can get a feature made. This is the first step to like a longer process to get it out of here. And you can already see too, maybe the process for him becoming a cranky old bastard someday is that he's already at this point, he's just like, also nobody's taking my shit away from me ever again. So that's kind of his mentality, I think, during this time.
Yeah. So they're shopping the film around. Like I said, nobody's touching it. And then one day, director John Landis showed a version of the film to a producer by the name of Jack Harris. Now, we mentioned Jack Harris briefly earlier, but Harris was a guy who had begun his career as a vaudeville promoter before kind of working his way up to being a B-movie producer. And his big success in the 50s was the original version of The Blob. That was a pretty big hit. But his specialty, especially by this point, was picking up student films for kind of next to nothing and then releasing them theatrically and making a little bit of money off of it. And he had produced John Landis's first film, a movie called Schlock in 1970. And they thought that, maybe we could do this again with Dark Star. But when he first saw Dark Star, he wasn't that impressed with it. He thought it had slow spots. He thought the quote unquote philosophical or philosophy student dialogue was kind of boring to him. But he did see something in it that he could exploit.
Yeah, he was kind of a guy like you kind of described him pretty well. And by the way, they were worried this whole time that the school was going to sue them if they found out that they were shopping this thing around. So back to that other story. But eventually, I think what happened there is the school started to look at it like, well, if it does make it, if nothing else, it's good advertisement for us. If John Carpenter.
Yeah, well, once it started getting known as it would get, they just kind of saw it as like, it's not worth it for us to sue, because then we're also going to be seen as the bad guys. But it'll be like, oh, a USC student made this movie, right? And that makes people want to come to USC.
Exactly. But to Jack Harris, I mean, he was like a big fan, like you said, of Schlock. I saw another one of his Equinox that he was
which was made by Dennis Muren, who did the special effects in Star Wars, I think. Did that movie.
Yeah. And so he liked finding up and comers, like people with nothing that had some kind of unique idea. And supposedly he was interested because he did like sci-fi and was interested in getting into that. But it was definitely these boring parts. You mentioned the blob thing. Carpenter hated him immediately, but he said that Harris constantly brought that up. That was like his thing. He said every conversation would be Jack Harris would bring up like, well, I did the blob.
Well, on the blob, we did this.
Right.
And when they met with Harris, he immediately started telling them how to change the film. He's like, I hate the first scene. He thought it's too long and boring. The way that he describes it is like, it's in the living quarters of the kids, and it's just like silent, and they're like sleeping. And then the way he says it, the way he describes it, says, for 7 minutes, you hear snoring and farting. Get rid of that, which they did, which is probably honestly a good idea.
Harris
said, wants to see this.
Yeah, Harris said he hated the title. We told him he hated the title. Somehow, I guess they kept that. But he said that it was like when they brought it to him, he had to get he had 90 minutes they had worked on, like they had been adding to it or whatever. They had gotten it up to 90 minutes or something by when Carpenter pitched it to him, he's like, "Can I see a screener?" So he's like, "Okay." So he takes him to see a screening, and he said that scene, and he's like in the sleeping room, and he's like, "It's a still cam, and the astronauts are just sleeping." And it's just, he's like, but you had this like 90-minute movie, and 30 minutes was probably straight garbage, and
you should cut out.
And he said, he waited like through that 7 minutes. He said he kept turning around to John Carpenter, being like, "Is something else going to happen?" And he's like, "Yeah, just stick with it, just stick with it." And he says,
like, nobody's going to want to see this.
Yeah, and he's like, "John, you can't start this out, or the audience is going to go to sleep too with these guys." He says, "John, we've got to make a solid hour 25 out of this thing." And he said, Carpenter's like, "I know. That's why the guy snore for so long." And he said, "No, John, you can't do it that way."
It's like when you write a paper in school and everything is very, very, very important.
Right. Yeah. So Jack Harris also wanted more sex appeal in the film. When this meeting, he's like, "Well, how about we add some women in bikinis on a beach?" I'm like, what beach are you talking about, Jack Harris?
The space beach.
The space beach.
Maybe he's talking about those women on the walls, like the pinups or whatever.
Yeah. So during this meeting, like Carpenter's sitting there, he's being quiet. I'm sure he's internally dying inside, but he's being fairly quiet, as Carpenter was wont to do. O'Bannon's just stewing, because every time he would try to speak up to defend the parts of the film that Harris didn't like, Harris would just like cut him off and not let him talk. So he does not like Jack Harris from the beginning. But finally, Harris said, "Okay, here's my deal." He's like, "I will give you the money to finish the film in exchange for 75% of the profits, but only if you make the changes that I want." Carpenter and O'Bannon, they took the money. They wanted to get their movie made. Here's what O'Bannon would later say about this. It says, quote, "This was a real turning point for both of us, I believe. I disliked Harris and wanted to get away. If this was the way the game is played, I wanted no part of it. But John concluded that he had to learn how to play." And that's something we'll learn about John Carpenter as we discuss him more, is that John Carpenter knew how to play the politics when he needed to,
Yeah. I mean, he definitely, from this point on, is like the guy who's like, "I know what I got to do to make this thing work in my favor. So I'm going to, like you said, play the game." He was able to get the gang back together with this money that they got. And I mean, for him, it worked out. They found Producer Studio, which is where they shot like the rest of this, which is the same
place that Eaten Alive was shot.
Yeah. A good point. Yeah. I didn't even think about that, but yeah, where Eaten Alive is shot. It's where he'll go back to for, like, I think it's sold on Precinct 13 and The Fog. He'll use that same studio. So, like, I mean, there's stuff working out for John O'Carpenter here, but John O'Carpenter. He says that John Carpenter had one thing I saw. He said that there's a scene, and I could not find it, and he didn't say exactly where it is, but he said there's a scene, if you watch close enough, and he can pick it out on this movie, where it's like at the end of the scene, and you can see Dan O'Bannon saying, "Fuck Harris."
He was not a fan.
He was very open about it. Jack Harris talks about it. Jack Harris calls Dan O'Bannon troubled. And but he says that for Carpenter, he says he was very unemotional, and that's how you do business.
Yeah. So like we said, Dark Star began pretty small, but it did begin to grow and eventually became something much different than what it was original, which was just a student film. So after they, cut all, I think, like the bullshit that Jack Harris didn't want in the movie, like guys farting for 7 minutes. It was like you had like a 45-minute film on your hands, which was too long for a collection of shorts that could play at a film festival, but too short for an actual theatrical release. And then Jack Harris gives them about $60,000 to turn the film into a feature length and move the production to a real studio. As Gary mentioned, it was Producer Studio in Hollywood, where Hooper had shot Eaten Alive. And then to fill out the runtime, they added a monster. So that the stuff with the alien that chases O'Bannon through the elevator shaft, that was not in the original script or film at all. So if you're watching this movie and you're like, this doesn't feel like it has anything to do with the rest of the movie, oh, that's why, because it wasn't originally supposed to be in the movie at all. So they're making this scene. They wanted to create this alien, and they ran into this problem of how do you make a convincing space alien when you have like no money to do any special effects with? So O'Bannon's original idea was just to do it kind of the old-fashioned way, a guy in a suit, 1950s alien guy in a suit, like the thing from another world. He bought a rubber suit from a rental house there in Hollywood, and it looked like shit. Like the seams were showing it, you could see the zipper, like it looked fake. It looked like somebody wearing a costume. So they kept brainstorming, and then inspiration hit when they're hanging out on set. O'Bannon and Carpenter are hanging out on set one day, and someone walked by with a giant beach ball, and you could see the beach ball, and you could see their feet kind of underneath, and it looked like the beach ball was walking on feet. So they thought, you know what? We know we can't make this like a realistic alien, so why not just make it funny? So that's what they did. They took a giant beach ball, they spray painted it red, they put some rubber feet on the bottom, and then they asked their friend Nick Castle to be the puppeteer on it.
Those feet, by the way, should look familiar. They are Creature from the Black Lagoon hands.
Yeah, they look like it.
Yeah, they're I think they said they got them from like who was it, like Post Prop Company or something. I don't know. Anyway, it's like they're Creature from the Black Lagoon's hands walking on the bottom of those feet.
Yeah, and I actually love this sequence of the movie. I mean, I know that it doesn't really have anything to do with the rest of the plot, but it does kind of hint at things to come in both Carpenter's and O'Bannon's careers, because the way that Carpenter shoots the alien kind of evokes the way he would later shoot Michael Myers. Like the alien would just kind of sit at one end of the hallway staring, camera turns away and it's gone, and then you turn around and it's somewhere else, it just appears. It's very Michael Myers.
It's so insane. I was thinking the same thing. And just like even the beats that he gives with the music and stuff, it's just like
it's a surprisingly effective suspense sequence for something that looks so dumb.
Right. Right. Yeah. And of course the elevator scene is it's the same way.
Yeah. And of course it would also kind of be the blueprint for Alien and stuff. You've got a lone alien in these long, seemingly never-ending corridors. Like it's very much kind of what O'Bannon would do a couple years later.
I found myself surprisingly stressed during the elevator scene.
Yeah,
so did I, dude. I thought it worked. I was like, this is really impressive for these guys. The elevator scene really has tension.
And during the filming of this sequence, they created the illusion that O'Bannon was... I don't even think we mentioned that O'Bannon does also star in this movie. Have we even mentioned that? O'Bannon plays Pinback in this movie. He's like,
well, I think characters. I mentioned that Carpenter had originally approached him to act, but I don't think we really established that.
So O'Bannon is Pinback. That's the guy we're talking about for the next few weeks. Is the guy who plays Pinback in this movie.
And in most of the added on stuff, because I mean, he's a big character in this because he's the one that was always available. Like he was the one that was there constantly when all these other guys had other stuff going on. So anyway.
And as the movie goes on, it's revealed that he's a much bigger character than you might think at the beginning of the movie. But during this alien sequence, they had to create a way to make it look like O'Bannon was hanging from an elevator shaft. So they did it in a pretty low-tech way, which was turning a camera on its side. So this is all being shot at Producer Studio, I believe. They had these like long hallways that were pretty uniform all around, so they could make it look like an elevator shaft if you shot it the right way. So for 3 days, O'Bannon had to be on his back in a sweltering corridor pretending to be fighting gravity. So what they did is they basically had essentially like a plank that had a little bit of give to it that O'Bannon was laying on, so that he would look like he was swaying and his feet could dangle and things like that. But he's laying on this plank for 3 days.
Well, they say even the other side of it's not really like it's not hooked in. There's guys on the other side of that wall like pushing down on it to like keep him supported, so it helps to like make that movement of like he would have the swaying.
So he's getting bounced up and down on his back the whole time.
Yeah.
So during the filming of this, he developed an excruciating pain in his side that took away his appetite and would send him to the hospital for a few days later. And it ended up being the first time that he was hospitalized with a lifelong struggle with a bowel condition, Crohn's disease, that would eventually take his life.
They brought him in for appendicitis, I think, or that was the initial.
Because that's about where it was hurting, was in his like appendix area.
Yeah, and I think I could swear I saw where his wife said they even took out his appendix, but they think that, this was the first attack probably from the Crohn's disease. And he always complained about stomach aches, and a lot of people thought O'Bannon was a hypochondriac, like that he was just making this stuff up, basically. But anyway, that's important just to mention here. I mean, this is the first attack from him, and this is going to be
yeah. And if you'll remember from last week's episode, Crohn's disease is what Heather O'Rourke was initially misdiagnosed with.
Oh yeah,
with her intestinal issues.
Yeah, it's no joke. I've have a friend who has it, and
I was almost diagnosed with Crohn's disease when I was younger, or not younger. Like, I mean, this was 8-9 years ago. I went to the emergency room with some intestinal stuff, and they thought at first that I had Crohn's disease till they did a few more tests. Yeah,
jeez,
that would have sucked.
Yeah. I've heard from multiple people who have.
Turns out I had really bad food poisoning.
Ugh, yeah, yeah. It's
still not fun.
No, still not fun. So, in regards to kind of the padding out of the film's runtime, O'Bannon would later say, he said, and this is actually in that documentary that Gary quoted earlier, which let's go ahead and say that documentary, Let There Be Light, it's on the Dark Star Blu-ray, big source for this episode.
Oh yeah.
Another big source for this episode is a book called Shock Value by Jason Zinnemann, which is it's my favorite film history book in my library of film history books that I have. It is essential and incredible, and I could not have done this episode without that book, basically, because they interview everyone involved in the making of
this fucking doc is like 2 hours long too.
I know,
it's pretty impressive.
It's longer than the movie.
Yeah.
So anyway, O'Bannon
how much snoring and farting is at the beginning?
There's no farting or snoring.
Just me this time, Todd. Just me.
But in that documentary, O'Bannon would say, we had what would have been the world's most impressive student film, and it became the world's least impressive professional film, which I think, and I'll get into this in a minute, but I think he's selling the movie short a little bit. But what he didn't like that they had to kind of do this. And Jack Harris, he bought the film, but he didn't keep it for that long because he was in the middle of a nasty divorce. He was having some financial trouble, had to sell the film. So he sells it to Bryanston Distributing. Now, if you're a longtime listener of the show, if you've been listening to this show for the last couple months,
if you're listening, Bryanston, we love you.
Bryanston Distributing was the same mob-run company that distributed the Texas Chainsaw Massacre the same year.
Okay.
Yeah, so this is just a few months. I mean, this movie gets released a few months after.
Sounds like a lot of speculation, Justin. We don't know anything, and so we would never blatantly say anything.
Allegedly.
It's alleged.
Yeah, from what I hear.
Yeah, so anybody from Bryanston listening, you do great work, and we appreciate it.
Yeah, well, they bungled the release of this film.
Just sounds like somebody's getting new shoes.
They sent it to over 40 theaters in Los Angeles, but they didn't really promote it. They had good promotional material because they worked with basically the promotional material that Jack Harris had created, the posters and stuff, but they didn't really send it out there properly. Like, it was in the newspaper, but audiences didn't really know that the movie existed. There was a trailer, but it wasn't accessible to people. It wasn't in front of movies that people were seeing.
Yeah, there was this whole part of it too where they tried to get in front of this group called FilmX, and they did, and it was like the right kind of film students, the people that would appreciate film students. So
FilmX was like a film festival. The Los
festival.
Angeles Film Festival was originally called FilmX.
That's it. Yeah, but it got pretty good, feedback there, so they were feeling good about it. And then it goes to Harris. Well, Harris, what ends up happening for him is he ends up in a marital issue, and so he's divorcing his wife of 30 years, and he is it's apparently a pretty rough one, and so he doesn't have time, so he gets Bryanston to work on some of this stuff, and they agree to use all of this stuff. So he's like, oh, this is cool, like it's like I'm doing this, but I don't have to do all the work. But then he finds out that all this stuff starts coming out that they were attached to the mafia, and then Harris has to cut ties because he's like, this is the last thing I need.
Yeah, I don't need this coming up for my divorce trial.
That I'm working with the mafia.
So on opening night, after Bryanston sends it out, Carpenter and O'Bannon, they decide they're excited. They're going to go into a movie theater to see how the audience was reacting. This is their first movie. This is awesome. We're really excited. We want to see how people are loving it. And so they go to this theater. They pick a movie theater there in Los Angeles. They asked the ticket taker if they could they're like, hey, can we just pop in and see the audience? And the ticket taker says, what audience? So they go into the theater. There's very few, there's like half a dozen people or something in there. There's like nobody in there. And they just sat in like depressing silence. Like nobody was laughing at the jokes in the film. Nobody seemed to understand or get that it was a comedy. And even, if you watch the Blu-ray, there's an introduction that Dan O'Bannon wrote for the film that has appeared on a few different Blu-ray and DVD releases of it, where he's like, we intended this to be a comedy, but nobody at the time it was released seemed to understand that this was a comedy. They didn't know that they were supposed to be laughing at it. So what audiences did get a chance to see it were not super receptive to it because I think they just didn't know what the filmmakers were trying to do. Mm. So that brings me, Gary, to our favorite segment on the show, one where we want to see what other audience members or other viewers of the film might think. And I'm wondering if modern viewers have caught on that this is supposed to be a comedy, what people think about it, and if they see it as a visionary sci-fi film or it's just a dud.
Well, Justin, as you know, internet reviewers are, if anything, they're the most patient and supportive reviewers out there. So many people watch Dark Star and they got the complete context of the film. And no, I'm just kidding. Anyway, lots of people hated it. And it sounds like somebody needs a nap. Let's see. Lady T says, after reading the reviews, I thought I'd give this one a try. I shouldn't have.
Lady T?
Lady T.
Is that Mr. T's wife?
It could be.
Oh.
Thought I'd give this one a try, and I shouldn't
have. She also
have.
pities the fool.
I pity the fool that watched this movie. What I should have done was paid more attention to the reviews that stated this film isn't for everyone. I would have saved myself some money. Looks like a low budget, which I guess it is, amateurish film, along the lines of the Blair Witch Project, which I didn't care for either. But heck, I like that better than this. And yes, I realize they're two totally different genres. It's like watching a homemade movie that maybe your uncle made while following someone around with his camcorder. I will admit that a few scenes made me smile simply because they made me think of the fun the actors and directors must have had making such a campy film. But with that said, I expected more than what I got, so I didn't care for it. Heck, I didn't even finish it. But to its credit, it solved my insomnia, at least for one night.
What a weird comparison to the Blair Witch Project.
Bet you didn't think you were going to get that.
That's the only low budget film they could think of to compare this to.
This movie's apparently good for sleeping. Here's T. Blackford. His review title is Warning, all caps, stay away. This movie is bad on every level. Bad acting, bad special effects, bad storyline. It's freaking boring. I love the sci-fi horror comedy medium, but this film is just straight up bomb. It's not like so bad it's funny. It's just so lame and uneventful. I fell asleep faster than my friend who floated a keg full of NyQuil. I'm telling you, please watch anything else. From the very first scene, you will be able to tell the quality of the film that you are getting yourself into. It's crap. And it never gets better from there. Forget about big names like John Carpenter and Dan O'Bannon. This was a school project of theirs. How many school projects have you ever done that were even remotely interesting? That's right, none. There is an alien in this movie. Prepared to be scared? Wait, no. Prepare to laugh. Oh, wait, no. Try neither. The alien is just a beach ball with feet. I'm serious. It's a beach ball. And our heroic characters are deathly afraid of it. What's worse is that more than a third of the film is dedicated to this inflatable menace. I just can't go on reliving any more of this film. It's bringing back the desire to play Russian roulette. Do yourself a favor and pass on this one. You will thank me.
Whew. Bringing back the desire to play Russian roulette.
Let's see here.
Somebody needs a nap and a therapist.
Yeah.
And the whole reason I brought up some of the other stuff that the people working on the movie did is because this last review says one of the worst sci-fi films of all time. I made the mistake of watching Dark Star late one night many years ago. It was one of the stupidest movies I have ever watched. 1, bad acting. 2, bad writing. 3, scientifically stupid plot. Destroying an entire planet because its orbit is unstable or in the way will only make matters worse. Instead of having one large, easily avoidable object, you'll have thousands of smaller but equally lethal and more difficult objects to track. 4, completely unrealistic characters. A painted beach ball as a space alien? The writers must have been doing too many drugs. Not surprisingly, the majority of actors that starred in Dark Star never did anything else. Of those that did do anything else, the majority never acted again after Dark Star. Therefore, having Dark Star on one's resume was a Death Star to one's career.
Don't think so.
It was written by Neil deGrasse Tyson, who understands.
And I just had to include that one because I was like, wow, you're way off on that last part, bud.
You're way off.
Everybody
on that
did other stuff. Everybody
literally.
else.
I mean, the actors didn't do anything like they didn't become big stars or anything. Brian Norell didn't become a big star, but he's continued to work in the industry for the last 50 years.
They're fine.
And John Carpenter and Dan O'Bannon and like everyone else involved. You know, you mentioned Bill Taylor earlier, which I was looking at his IMDb. Like the if you just list the movies that he did matte paintings on after this, you know, he worked with freaking Hitchcock on Family Plot. You know, he did The Wiz, he did the Blues Brothers, he did John Carpenter's The Thing, he did Blade Runner. Like, to say that this guy didn't do anything after this movie is sort of insane.
Right. Yeah. Everybody continued to work after this movie.
Yeah. And most of them continue to work even to this day. And despite the audiences at the time and some of these internet reviewers not really responding to the film, it has actually gained a big cult following, probably largely due to the later careers of its creators. But I mean, at the time that it came out, I kind of do get why some people wouldn't get it, because it does look unlike anything that had come before it in terms of sci-fi. You know, like you were used to sci-fi being more, I don't know, glamorous, I guess, you know, space travel looking more glamorous. But O'Bannon created a movie, you know, as he and Carpenter called it, it's a movie about truck drivers in space. None of the glamour that you were used to seeing was there. These guys, the characters in it, they weren't like awed or amazed by the sights of the universe. They were like bored by it.
Yeah.
And that lived in space aesthetic was one that would, of course, you know, be popularized by Star Wars and then with Alien. I like the idea though that they're, you know, not all space jobs are glamorous. You know, even in Star Wars, you don't really see that. You don't see the janitors on the Death Star.
Yeah.
At least not. I'm sure that's coming to Disney Plus at some point, but
Right.
not yet.
But no, I mean, to complain about that, like that's part of the problem with the movie. I mean, that's the point of the movie. I mean, these guys are doing a very redundant, stupid job. Like that's
it's mundane.
That's what the movie's about.
Me and Todd were talking about this the other day, and I think I really like the way that you described it, Todd, when we were talking. It's that you called this Clerks in space.
Yeah.
And I think that's exactly what it is. It's just like, this is just 3 dudes with a job, and it's a boring job that they don't really like. And it's very mundane until it isn't.
Yeah, exactly.
On this particular day.
Yeah. And I think, looking at the basic formula for Clerks and Dark Star, it's very similar. You know, they happen to have a convenience store to shoot in. Well, these guys were shooting in hallways and just turning the camera sideways and using the techniques that they learned in school to their fullest potential, in my opinion. You know, especially I wouldn't even say it's a shoestring budget; it's a shoe thread budget. They really did as much as they could with what they.
This movie's got about the same budget as Clerks. Granted, not with inflation taken into account, but 60 grand's about what Clerks cost, I think, too, right?
Somewhere around in there.
These guys are doing it with special effects and shit. Like, what Kevin Smith was paying for was film stock mostly.
Exactly.
And maybe paying the actors or buying them lunches and stuff, but film stock is mostly what he paid for. They're having to pay for, they're making a spaceship and space shoots and an alien. And, it's kind of crazy, but even story wise, like it kind of fits in the Clerks thing. Cause these are just like blue collar dudes working a job. Only this time the job happens to be in space. They're they're not like cool looking. They're not wearing cool uniforms. Their uniforms are kind of baggy and gross. They've got long hair. They're unkempt. They look like they probably smell bad.
Yeah.
Their living quarters is trashed. It's just cluttered with junk with pinup girls on the wall. And they're out of toilet paper, and they're irritable, and they're unappreciated by their corporate overlords.
Yeah, you're 100% right. That scene the scene where Harris had a problem with it was like 7 minutes. They were I forget who was telling this story. It must have been Bill, but he was saying that because we're on a first name basis. Anyway, he was saying like part of that 7 minutes was it eventually gets to like where the computer is like telling them like, all right, rise and shine, everybody. It's time to get up. And then they just stay asleep. And it's like, all right, let's start a warm shower. And then you could hear the showers come on and they don't move. Like, all right, everybody, wash your face. Here's your fresh clothes. And they don't move. It's just like, breakfast is served now. And then all of a sudden they're like, all right, let's go. So they're just sitting there in their own filth, just like you said, just
I think
nasty bastards.
I think with the going back to comparing it to Clerks like we did earlier this week, Justin, when we spoke, I think with this, because I'll be honest, like when I sat down to watch this, I was like, okay, this is gonna be fun, kind of hokey, that's supposed to be a comedy, this will be fine. And I did feel it sort of drag on a little bit, and then the little beach ball alien comes in and was like, okay, that's kind of silly, whatever. But that, the novelty of that burns off pretty quickly. But then when the bomb becomes self-aware and starts quoting the Bible, I went, holy shit. And I think the monotony of their daily lives and the silliness of this alien is very disarming. It breaks down like what you might think space should look like, which sounds like that was kind of their whole point. People were getting used to this pristine space from 2001 and maybe other things, and so they showed this kind of lived in worn,
uncomfortable
version of space. And then when the bomb becomes self-aware and quotes the Bible, and that's laid in the game, but like is that a reward for folks who stuck it out through the rest of this? Because in talking about comedy, some of the comedy doesn't really translate, and I'm sure you guys are well aware, like comedy, especially in film, can have a very short shelf life. Stuff that played well in the 70s and 80s may not play as well as it does today. And when you
comedy is also like comedy along with horror, I think, is the most subjective of genres, in that you can't tell somebody why they think something's funny or why they think something is scary. Right. Either they do or they don't.
Right, exactly.
Or porn. Like what gets my dick? What gets my dick hard gets my dick hard.
Gary broke his governor a long time ago. It's nothing without tentacles, folks.
I also appreciate they kept blowing up places. They had the Bob stuff, like the Bob carrier things. Mm-hmm. But I'm like, all right, well, this is Bob 20. So
the Bob ship ain't like a third of the size of the whole ship.
Right, exactly.
Where they hit the other 19. So it sounds like you liked it, Todd. So I guess this is the section of the show we call Todd's Take.
Yeah.
It sounds like you enjoyed it overall though, right?
I did. I was kind of I was down because the past couple things have been some horror, and I'm a big, and I like sci-fi, so
not a horror guy though.
my list is about ready to go, folks. If you
better be, because we're doing an episode.
We have people
for anyone who's been waiting.
Todd.
People are asking for Todd's top 10. For those of you who have been waiting the last few weeks for Todd's top 10 horror movies, they're coming. We're just going to make a bonus episode.
But yeah, I did. I was excited to sit and watch, and then popped it in Friday night with some pizza and the wife, and just sat ready to enjoy it, and then kind of got sucked into this whole lived in space feel. And I'll be honest, my eyes got a little bit heavy there, probably about a third of the way in. And I was just kind of like, no, this is, let's hang on. Cause the names attached to this thing, and there's a reason we're talking about it on the show. Let's hang on here. And boy, was I pleasantly surprised, because I mean, eyebrows up, sat up, audible response of holy shit. Like, this is worth, if you haven't seen this and you're about to, and you may think it's going to be slow, just hang on.
How do you think the comedy plays?
Comedy plays, it's a little stale.
Yeah,
I see part of the problem is
it's
like
a little stale.
It doesn't come across as a comedy right at first. I mean, I guess if you know it's a comedy, it does, but it's like, I don't know, the title of the movie and the way that it looks on the cover, it just,
I think the fact that they play that country song over the opening credits immediately establishes that we're not taking ourselves too seriously on this.
Right. I don't know. I mean,
something like that works, but that kind of, in terms of the comedy, I feel like that's their best gag, and they kind of,
my favorite,
and it kind of
my favorite comedy gag is probably Dan O'Bannon's character's video diaries, where he reveals that he's not actually Pinback, and he's just got a variety of like very bad haircuts. And I just love that whole, and they never comment on that subplot. Yeah. But all of a sudden for the next, because that's like halfway through the movie, and for the rest of the movie, you realize this guy is not even who he says he is, and nobody gives a shit, because that's how meaningless these guys' jobs is, that nobody even cares that he's not.
Nobody,
because
he's not the actual dude.
I forgot about that, but yeah, like part of the way through, he's just kind of like, I'm actually a fuel engineer or something like that, and I'm here. Pinback's underwear does not fit appropriately.
It's like it sags. He had a bigger dick than I do.
I think for him studying psych, I kind of, and I feel like some of those skills and some of that insight and some of that education was applied in the script, at least a little bit, but I kind of would have liked to have seen something a little more fleshed out in terms. I mean, they dealt with the characters in terms of their psyche on the ship, but I feel like that could have been explored just a little bit more to get folks more engaged with these characters. And maybe that would have not, for the folks that do find it too boring and decide to complain about it online, maybe that's something that would have given them maybe that's something that would have allowed them to connect with those characters a little bit more.
Yeah. So not long after the film was completed, O'Bannon, he starts telling their friends, he's like, I did so much work on this film that it's misleading to call Carpenter the director. It's like, I'm as responsible for what's on screen as John was. John Carpenter gets word of this, and he already I think our Carpenter already understands the power of like being known as an auteur at this point, because after this, every film that John Carpenter ever did says a John Carpenter film on it. Dark Star doesn't say that. But starting with Assault on Precinct 13, they all say a John Carpenter film. He knows that it's important to have his name above the title. So he hears about this, that O'Bannon's telling people, hey, I should probably be maybe credited co-director on this. He takes O'Bannon out to a restaurant to set things straight. He told O'Bannon, he's like, I'm the director and no one else. And then he tells him that they needed to stop working together. And O'Bannon was taken aback a little bit by this. He said, here's a quote from O'Bannon regarding that. He says, this really stunned me. John taught me a lot about human nature. People will do terrible things to other people in order to grab all the cookies and run away with it. Up to that point, I had a naive notion that if you're real good friends with someone, you'll be loyal forever. John taught me that it's not true. Some people will cut your head off, run away, and not look back. So him and their partnership had a pretty acrimonious ending, and they never reunited. This isn't like a story where it's like, they parted ways in a bad way, and then later on they got back together. Like we talked about with Tobe Hooper and Steven Spielberg. Where they kind of got on bad terms because of that whole shit. But then 3 years later or whatever, Tobe Hooper's directing an episode of Amazing Stories or whatever. So they're never friends again. And the two parted ways, and Dark Star becomes a calling card for Carpenter because it says directed by John Carpenter on it. And he went on to continue his career. His next thing he does is he starts writing scripts, and he writes The Eyes of Laura Mars, which is directed by Irvin Kershner, who directed Empire Strikes Back, and then moved on with his own directing career, of course, with Assault on Precinct 13 and Halloween. and working with many of the same people that he worked with on this film. And Carpenter would later say this about Dark Star. Dark Star was one of the most difficult, brutalizing, devastating, and satisfying experiences of my life. It was not successful. It was a weird little science fiction movie with a lot of imagination and energy, but a cardboard spaceship. I wanted it to be slick and professional with suspense and a sense of humor. Instead, it was youthful, naive, and innocent. And he even says on the documentary on that Dark Star Blu-ray that we've mentioned a couple times, which, by the way, he didn't even participate in the documentary. They used audio from another interview.
Well, neither did Dan O'Bannon.
Well, he was dead. So they used archive footage for him.
Spoiler.
But he even says, yeah, it's not my best, which it's not. It's not his best. It's not his third best.
He says like he hasn't even watched it in forever. But I mean, just from my boy John, let me just say, I mean, the reason I told that story earlier is the guy's already had a run in with what happens when somebody pulls it out from under you when you felt like you've worked hard on something. And so if you are in that documentary, for instance, like every actor they talk to, every single one says John Carpenter was the director of that movie. This wasn't a Toby Hooper situation. This is like not even like dispute. Everybody was like, yeah, Dan was hands-on, but every cast member says John Carpenter sat in the director's role. But he was a good listener. He was a collaborator, I saw. But when a question arose, we had a decision to make. We didn't have to go to executives. You went to John Carpenter. He was in charge of this movie. And
yeah, so, I mean, I said this before. I think John Carpenter deserves the directing credit on this. But as far as the definition of an auteur comes up, you know, John Carpenter is not the singular author of this movie. I've got a lot of thoughts about the whole auteur theory anyway, because as we've discussed before, especially last week on our Poltergeist episode, film is a very collaborative medium. Right. And there are very few filmmakers that deserve the auteur title. I think John Carpenter does on some movies. I think on this movie, his co-author is Dan O'Bannon. John Carpenter directed it, but O'Bannon co-created it.
I'm just trying to get inside of what may have been going on in his head, and I think that was that he's already seen the rug pulled out from under him before with his short film, but he wants to be credited. He wants people to acknowledge that because
he wants this to lead to the next thing.
And for him, he even tells a story that, you know, he remembers being at lunch with Dan O'Bannon just sitting there. They couldn't get work. It wasn't like Eyes of Laura Mars fell into his lap. It was that they were sitting there and he said he couldn't get work afterwards.
Jack Harris helped.
Yeah, he had to go to Jack Harris to get help. He had to go back and play that game again because he
which O'Bannon was not willing to do.
Yeah, and which O'Bannon was not willing to do. And Carpenter says he remembers sitting at lunch with O'Bannon being like, we're not hot shit, man. Like we thought we were, and we were coming out of this and we thought we would be. But
we thought everyone would be knocking our door down.
Yeah, and they're not.
It didn't happen that way.
And so Carpenter went out and found that Eyes of Laura Mars book, I guess it was, and he got a screenplay together and brought it to Harris, and Harris thought it was all right. And said somebody, I forget, whoever was the producer on it, I'm sure one day we'll talk about it, happened to stop in his office and see it. And it was just like a luck of the draw thing. Like he was like, what is this? And he read it and was like, well, I want this. And so Harris, having the relationship he did with Carpenter, was like, yeah, take it, but you know, make sure you include John Carpenter in this. And that led on to the other stuff. But you know, for Carpenter, it was still like he wanted credit, I think. And I had this quote here from him about Dan O'Bannon, and he says, "We had an intense relationship, and the last thing you want as a director is another guy who wants to be the director. Dan is talented, he's terrific, but I don't want to work with him. I'm giving up something. I'm giving up Dan's imagination. He's a tremendous actor, he's a tremendous writer, he's an idea guy, but better to be on my own, better to make it or fail on my own, rather than have a symbiotic relationship with somebody who only wants to undo me as a director." So we said goodbye.
I mean, it's kind of a bummer, but I also think that I think O'Bannon and Carpenter, it would have been cool to see what
else
other
they could
things
have
they could have
done.
collaborated
Yeah.
on. Yeah, what else they could have done. Because I think I think John Carpenter is an incredible director. And I think O'Bannon is an incredibly imaginative guy, which is why we're doing this whole series on him. Because
I feel like we
Carpenter
just
said,
did
he
play
is an idea
defend
man.
it. Yeah, I feel like we just play plaintiff and defend it with it. But I mean, really what it boils down to for me is like, I'm looking at them and I'm like, these are just two headstrong people that.
Yeah, which doesn't always work, you know. I do think that they both sell the movie short a little bit. I mean, obviously they would go on to do bigger and better things. And maybe in retrospect, looking back, they're like, yeah, Dark Star wasn't great. Well, it was your first thing. Your first thing's never your best thing. Right? Usually.
Yeah. You'd imagine. I mean, I guess for
especially while you're still learning.
Yeah, it must feel like that though. Like if somebody brought up your high school writing project or something and they're like, this is what this guy can do. And you're like, shit. Well, wait. Like
it's not like a band who's playing together for 5 years before making their first album. Like, yeah, okay, that's their first album and it's a masterpiece. Well, they've been playing together for 5 years. The movies aren't the same way. It's like, yeah, they may have made some short films, but this is their first real thing. They're still in the learning process.
Right.
And I think Dark Star is remarkably innovative and ambitious for what started out as a student project. I think the limitations, I think it makes those limitations work in its favor. You know, like the little helmets, you know, which are just toy helmets. You know, we talked about the innovation of being able to get the actor to actually breathe in that helmet and not fog it up. Like, that's super clever, but also it works in the favor of the film narratively because it looks very uncomfortable. Like wearing that helmet looks very uncomfortable. And that was kind of their whole thing with this movie, making space travel look uncomfortable. Like, it is an uncomfortable thing. That's why they're crammed into that little cockpit where one person can't get out without, it's like being the guy on the inside of a booth at a restaurant. Like, oh, I got to get out and use the bathroom. And the other two people have to move, you know. They're trying to make space look uncomfortable. So using a little toy helmet that's literally too small for the guy's head because it's made for a child works in that case.
Yeah.
Or in that like hyperdrive sequence that we mentioned earlier, like that's just O'Bannon figuring something out. Like, how do I do this? Let's figure it out and make it look cool. He wasn't imitating something he'd seen before. He just pulled that from his brain. And that was something that had never been done before that is now like just general shorthand for hyperdrive or warp drive in science fiction movies. Yeah. And that's just something that they had to figure out because they didn't have any other way to do it. Like, I love that.
If for nothing else, I mean, I'm not sure that I would, you know, say Dark Star's like in the top 2 or 3 of either one of these guys' movies. But it's definitely fascinating just to see like the early stages of, well, genius. Like, I mean, just these guys and like what was going to come from all of them, and just the collaborative effort. I mean, I would even say like just what everybody put into this thing. You were talking about film being collaborative, but I mean, but yeah, just, I mean, from the score to the shots that are in it, just to the thinking outside the box to get it done. I mean, that's some cool stuff, man, when you know the story behind it and then what these guys are going to go off to do. I mean, even so far as to say, like you talked about earlier, the alien being a precursor to Michael Myers. I mean, it's just interesting to see like the early stages of what these guys have.
Hollywood, you know, they didn't really, John Carpenter got his chance. He eventually, you know, they weren't knocking down their doors, but he eventually got work writing The Eyes of Laura Mars, and which would lead into him doing Assault on Precinct 13. But they weren't paying much attention to Dan O'Bannon in the wake of Dark Star's release. But then there would be one guy who would seek O'Bannon out, somebody far outside of Hollywood, which was an experimental director by the name of Alejandro Jodorowsky. He was looking to film an adaptation of Frank Herbert's Dune, and he had seen Dark Star, and he had been so impressed by the special effects that he wanted O'Bannon to do the special effects for his new film. And it seemed like this was going to be like O'Bannon's big break. You know, but as we know, that version of Dune never happened. It's one of the great unmade films of all time. And when it fell apart, it nearly ruined Dan O'Bannon. If you want a really good look at this story, there's a movie called Jodorowsky's Dune full-length documentary that's all about this. It talks a lot about O'Bannon's involvement in this, and it's a fascinating look at what would have been one of the wildest movies to ever exist. And you also watch that documentary and you're like, yeah, I get why nobody wanted to film this. It's insane. The Jodorowsky's idea was that he would find the most talented visual artists in the world, put them in a room together, and let the best ideas win. So he signed up Salvador Dali, who didn't come in person. He would just submitted things because he's Salvador Dali. Right. French artist Mobius, who is a very well-known French comic book artist. British illustrator Chris Foss, also very well-known. Swiss surrealist artist H.R. Giger, and then Ron Cobb and Dan O'Bannon.
So there'd be dicks in it though. With Giger, there'd be some dicks in it.
Oh, there definitely would be. Yes. Yeah. And in fact, it's wild because you watch. We'll probably get into this more next week, but there's some concept art that Giger did for this movie, for Dune, that would later show up in. We all know Giger ends up doing Alien, but there's some specific imagery that shows up in like Prometheus, like that. Ridley Scott referenced way on down the line. It's kind of wild to see.
Interesting.
But O'Bannon loved this idea of getting a bunch of artists in a room. Like, this is where this movie's starting from, because it's starting as art and design, not with a bunch of producers and suits and guys just looking for something to sell. Guys like Jack Harris. So he gets to live. He gets brought out to Paris. He gets to live in Paris for months. He's treated like a VIP. But the Dune production would eventually collapse due to money issues. Nobody wanted to fund it. Hollywood was understandably wary about financing a film with Jodorowsky as a director. And if you've seen any Jodorowsky films, you might understand that, but especially one with the budget that this one would have required. And the collapse of the film meant that O'Bannon was sent back to Los Angeles. But here's the thing. All of his shit was in Paris. So what happens is, Dune shuts down. He actually had traveled to Los Angeles. He wasn't actually sent back to Los Angeles. He had traveled to Los Angeles to do something for the film and was going to go back to Paris, where all of his stuff was. Like, literally everything he owned was in Paris. And while he's in Los Angeles, the film shuts down, and he doesn't have a home in Los Angeles. He's staying on what would the couch of the woman who would end up being his wife. He's staying on her couch, but all of his belongings, everything he owns, is in Paris. He didn't have he wasn't renting an apartment because he knew he was living in Paris for months. Well, when the production shuts down, he no longer has a place in Paris, even though all his stuff is there. He doesn't have a home in Los Angeles. So he is now broke and homeless, essentially. Oh. And it forced him to depend on friends to survive. So he goes, like, he's couch surfing, essentially. And one of the friends that he ends up staying at their house for a while is a guy named Ron Shusett. So while O'Bannon is staying at Shusett's house, sleeping on his couch, the two began to discuss collaborating on a new movie project. Shusett is also a writer. They ended up revisiting a previous script that O'Bannon had been working on. So kind of an idea that he had that kind of spawned from some stuff that he had done on Dark Star. And that script would eventually turn into a film that we all know as Alien.
Deep Throat. Oh, Alien.
So that's where we're going next week, guys. We're going to Alien next week. Obviously, a much more well-known film probably than Dark Star, but another one that O'Bannon, was integral in getting to the big screen, and probably the most well-known of any film that he was directly involved in. So that's going to be the story we're telling next week. Part 2 of our Dan O'Bannon series.
It's going to be interesting. It's going to be a short episode, though. There's not a lot to say about Alien, I'm sure. Not a lot of information.
Not a lot of information out there about that one. But that's it, guys. That's part 1 of our Dan O'Bannon series. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Nice. I'm glad that you guys seem to enjoy the film. I don't know if either of you had ever seen it. I don't think Todd had.
No, that was a Dark Star. That was a first view for me.
There's a few John Carpenters that I haven't seen that I've just saved for like a rainy day, that like one day I'm like, let's see this thing John Carpenter did.
We'll get to a John Carpenter career overview down the line, I'm sure, because there's so much to say about him. And
well, we won't have to talk about Dark Star, will we?
No, we won't. We've covered it. And next week we're covering our first Ridley Scott movie as well. So,
look at that.
What do you guys want to let our audience know where you can be found on the internet?
I am at This is Gary Horn on all the social medias. I do a wrestling podcast. It's at TIPW Show. You can find it. It's called This is Pro Wrestling.
It's also on the official NWA YouTube channel.
I was about to say, we're now officially moved to the official NWA channel for a show called This is the NWA, and it's going to be available on Tuesdays at 7:05. You can watch that if you want to. NWA Power is on Fight TV, so you can watch.
So your boss is Billy Corgan now.
Technically, my boss is Billy Corgan now. Yes, not even technically. No, technically, nice. I just had to write him a complete synopsis and send it to him on what I expected the show to be, so that he had confidence that it would be.
Life is weird.
Life is weird.
Life is weird. You're the lead singer of your favorite band growing up is now your boss.
There's I know, it's crazy.
One of your
bosses.
There's
layers of getting to him. I don't just go to him with my problems, but he's at
the top. He's at the top.
He's overseeing it. Yes.
Nice.
Crazy. Todd, how about you, man?
I am at Mr. Todd A. Davis on all the socials, and I have a podcast as well called Computer Resume Podcast. It's all about Star Trek.
Your boss is Gene Roddenberry.
Oh, well, I was going to actually, my boss is Neelix. Damn it.
Your boss is the corpse of Gene Roddenberry.
Jesus.
Man.
But yeah, we're covering the entire Star Trek franchise in chronological order, and both Gary and Justin have appeared and will appear again if they will. Because right now we're in the middle of Star Trek Enterprise, and that's a bit of a chore to watch. But we're having fun, and I think we've got some good episodes are really right around the corner. So I'm looking.
I did enjoy the meme you posted the other day about how to defeat COVID, and you play the theme from Enterprise over and over again until it kills itself.
Yeah, that's not far off from the truth, guys.
I'm at Justin_Bishop, and you can find me on Twitter, Instagram, Letterboxd, and all that stuff. The show, most importantly, is at cinema_shock, or you can find us at cinemashock.net. Like us on Facebook, Twitter, all that stuff, and rate and review. Send us to your friends. You got friends who are fans of Alien or Return of the Living Dead or John Carpenter or any of the other stuff that we're talking about on this Dan O'Bannon series. Send them this episode. Let them know where Dan O'Bannon's story began.
Yeah.
Thank you for your input, Gary.
All right.
Until next week.
May the wings of liberty never lose a feather.
That's from a John Carpenter movie.
It is.
Be excellent to each other. Not from a John Carpenter movie, although I would watch John Carpenter's version of that.
Johnny has the keys, and he took them to Space Beach.
What?
That's where all the bikini clad women Dark Star.
We're
they're on Space
25 episodes into this podcast or something now, right? Like 30 episodes in.
Mm-hmm.
It's just part of it now.
Can we just come up with like a catchphrase that's like motivational to people?
Well, I'll see what I can do. It's hard to argue when your wife bought my t-shirt.
I'll burn it.
Your wife. All right, I gotta go get COVID vaccine.
All right, go get it, Gary. Good luck with the microchip.
Thanks.